Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our symposium and the second panel, Climate Adaptation, Alternative Strategies and Perspectives. My name is Patsy Lewis. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And I would like to introduce our chair for this afternoon's panel. And she is Professor Macarena Gomez Barris, who is the Timothy C. Forbes and Ann S. Harrison University Professor of Modern Culture and Media and Chair of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She is a writer and scholar with a focus on the decolonial environmental humanities, authoritarianism, and extractivism, queer Latinx epistemes, media environments, racial ecologies, cultural theory, and artistic practice. She is the author of 4 books, including The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives, that examines 5 scenes of ruinous extractive capitalism, and Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Political Undercurrents in the Americas, a text of critical hope about the role of submerged art and solidarities in troubled times. And it's my pleasure to hand over these proceedings to Professor Gomez Barris.
Great. Hello, everyone. Did you have enough time to eat? Not really, right? It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Patsy. And, you know, there were so many enlivened conversations that came up in the last panel. I think it was really important discussions to think not only hemispherically, but globally about these issues and locally. So I hope we'll continue that today. Today, we were going to have 4 speakers, but we have 3 speakers, and I think that'll give us plenty of time then for Q&A, so I look forward to that. So our first speaker will be Jerónimo Barrera de la Torre, who holds a PhD in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on the political ecology of forest conservation, historical geography, post-status geographies, and the epistemology of geography itself, including participatory cartography. He's worked with indigenous Chatino peoples and the campesino communities in Oaxaca, Mexico, in relation to local knowledge and understanding of landscapes through language. He's also worked with communities on the effects of forest conservation and management and programs on land commons. So I look forward to engaging and hearing from Jerónimo about what land commons are exactly, since some of those terminologies are also in question. Our second presenter will be online, I believe, and that is Immaculata Casimero, an indigenous Wapichan woman from Guyana. She is a communication officer of the South Rupani District Council, a local indigenous organization that represents 21 communities within the Wapichan territory. Casimero is also chair of the Aishara Tun Women's Association, a community-based organization which comprises 15 women in her village. Her journey as a village leader began in 2015 when she was elected as a village councilor, and so I hope we'll be able to talk with her about local politics, governance, and questions of indigenous autonomous governance as well. Our third, but not last presenter, is William San Martin, an assistant professor of global environmental science, technology, and governance in the Department of Integrative and Global Studies at Worcester Polytech Institute, and also a research fellow the Earth Systems Governance Project at Utrecht University. His work examines global environmental inequities with particular attention to disparities of power and agency across human, environmental, and technological entities. And I had the opportunity of engaging William in a Latin American consortium and network that they're creating over there, and it'd be really wonderful if we had the opportunity to connect with WPI and Brown University across this regional discussion. So welcome to Jerónimo, and thank you all for being here today. I look forward to a lively panel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Patsy, for organizing and inviting me, and Kate and Emily for having this panel together. Well, today I'm gonna talk about one of my research interests that is carbon offsetting in Mexico. I will not be touching exactly the part of the commons right now, but happy to talk more about that. And I think Mexico is especially, well, a particular example of commons in indigenous because of its history and the revolution. So the first thing that I want to say is that in this presentation I want to first of all demonstrate the significance of this market. I'm especially interested in the voluntary or international and voluntary carbon market, which is contributing, and that's one of my arguments here, contributing to the idea of the idea of resource frontiers, that advancing and producing new resources in these communities. And also the consequences and effects, particularly in this presentation, of the inequalities or economic inequalities of these kind of interventions in communities, indigenous and campesino communities. So the first thing I want to talk is that carbon offsets are key to understand the new trends in, one, the commodification of forest and land, and the second, the expansion of this resource frontier through the reconfiguration of networks of accumulation, where coloniality and extractivism continue to linger in the region. This work has been done through several years, including participatory observation, interviews, documental analysis, ethnography, and also filming some events related to carbon in the communities. And also, I want to say that in this presentation, I'm more interested in how is this value chain and commodities about the carbon is created and get these carbon credits get value. In not exactly how the communities are negotiating or challenging this perspective. No? But I want to say that this is complex and contradictory because most of these programs, and I will explain more later, most of these programs are part of a community-led forestry program. So many of these communities decide to implement not only carbon, but mostly they are into other environmental conservation programs. So first of all, what are these international voluntary carbon markets? Broadly, we can say that there are two types of markets, the compliance market and the voluntary ones. The latter is based on the idea that cities, corporations, individuals can trade their emissions in projects implemented elsewhere. But trade of credits or certification is non-compulsory and it's triggered by public image concerns or moral obligations, as there is no emission cap which the participants should reach. The verification emission reductions or carbon credits, that is what is being sold, there is just a piece of paper, require a certification, adherence to international standards, and protocols for the measurement of this carbon sequestration and qualification of the bonus that I will talk more in later. And also it is a type of mechanism that is being used for other new technological investment in carbon sequestration. So it's part of this, for example, we have more technologies like wind or for the lithium, etc. So these carbon are used as part of the financialization of this type of new technological investments. So one of my main targets is to show that this is a fast-growing market. Even though there is growing literature highlighting the colonial aspect of this type of, they call it carbon colonialism, aspects of this type of climate change mitigation measures, and activists and even government pushing against it, it is expanding around the world, particularly in indigenous and campesino communities, something that echoes what we have been discussing previously, who steward and live in most of the remaining forests in the world. Mexico's carbon market is not the exception. It's growing really fast. So let's take the example of one entity that is called Climate Action Reserve from California that has been instrumental in developing the voluntary carbon market in Mexico since 2014. So in the first map, in the FAP, this part of the presentation they did in 2018, you can see in the lower part that the projects in Mexico are just 7. That includes also landfill and not only forestry. But if you see the table, you can see that there is a rapid increase of forestry programs in the country, sorry. Both listed and registered sum up to 188 projects. And from those that are already registered, the number of offset tons are more than 1,200,000. So from all of these projects, 77% of the projects are community owned. So ejidos or communities are the owner of these projects. And moreover, there are, how can I say this? There's an entity called Mexico CO2, Mexico Public, they call it that. And it's a subsidiary of the Mexican Stock Exchange that just appeared in the last 5 years to oversee and serve as the platform for the voluntary carbon market in Mexico. And this marks the increased wave of projects and the new trends in the emission trading markets in Mexico. So in the graph, I want to show you how from all these universe of projects, Oaxaca, which is in the place I'm working right now, is the one that is registering more tons in all Mexico. And examples of the others are from other projects that are not related to Climate Action Reserve, which is the one that is working in Oaxaca, but there are other entities working in Mexico as well. So as the Ecosystem Marketplace, which is an initiative of the nonprofit Forest Trends, in their last report, state that this carbon voluntary market is a growing and fast-moving market, have positively reviewed in their website some of the projects implemented in Mexico. So I just want to now turn to the place and the communities I'm working with. San Juan La Chao is in the far west of the of the Chatino region. It's close to, but in the state of Oaxaca, and in the south of Mexico. And this is a very important place because carbon is the last of a series of communities that have reinvented the territory of La Chao once and again as a resource frontier. Coffee, timber, cattle, and carbon have been since the 19th century advancing this frontier. In terms of forestry, it is worth noting that in the Chatino region, there were different companies working in the 80s and 90s, exploiting more than 2,000 hectares of this territory. And the case of La Chao, it was important because one of these companies worked for several years exploiting all the old forests and opening new forestry roads. And well, however, carbon is part of a much larger project by communities in La Chao to manage their common land, forest, and stop deforestation by cattle expansion. So I want also to point some of these paradoxical and contradictory consequences. The community-led programs initiated in 2010 and included timber extraction, payment for environmental services, cloud forest conservation, among others. And in 2014, the pilot protocol for carbon voluntary market in Mexico at a level of communities was developed here in La Chao as the ground zero for voluntary markets in the area. And this, the area that is part of of the voluntary market carbon is the same that is used for timber extraction. The carbon market interventions have been questioned over the decades for numerous reasons. For example, as a dangerous distraction in climate change mitigation, a form of land grabbing in indigenous and community lands, as green grabbing, as we discussed, as disrupting local uses of land, and imposing a technocratic rule over the forest management in communities. I want to stress as well that the emission trading procedures, this is a part of the carbon chain, produces an uneven and hierarchical geography, emission, and the structure in part of this carbon colonialism. So how is the process of producing this new resource in these territories? So first of all, the carbon credits are sold by San Juan La Chao as a community through this voluntary carbon. And they have offsetting emissions for Palo Alto, California, as the city. The city, they buy the carbon. And then also a trading company, which is Cool Effect, who also is based in California, which sells the credits to a variety of consumers like Salesforce, Audi, Twitter, etc. So this is more like a broker. The first stage or phase in the project is the project staging, and Juan La Chao has a very important place here. Elaborated by Climate Action Reserve with this investment by Walt Disney Corporation, the support of the government agency, which is Semarnat, and the Clinton Foundation as well. The protocol was finished in 2014, then published in 2016, and then amended until 2020. Next, as part of this is what I call abstraction. And I'm saying abstraction as abstraction and displacement that tear processes from their life world to become objects of exchange, as Anne-Tyson is calling. So this carbon becomes known through very highly technical processes that requires resources and technique support. Abstraction means qualifying. There is inventorying, which is based on extrapolations across the forest from plots where they measure the quantity of carbon that is sequestrated. Then the next step is assessing the quality of these credits, which is related more to the type of program that is implemented in these communities. So this is, there is a difference between the core value of a carbon credit, which is just the carbon per se, and there is the add-ons, which is the social and cultural aspects around the carbon. No? So if these projects are participatory, community-led, they have a plus. If they are in a very highly biodiverse forest, they have an add-on, etc. Verifying its permanence, that is, if the community is not deforesting this, say, or using it for agriculture or other uses. Moreover, the process implicates community members that became técnicos comunitarios or forestry local technicians. This is a knowledge transfer that is not without content by the communities, as I will mention later. Later on, if they have this inventory, they have all the tons that supposedly this forest can sequestrate in a year, which is every time that they measure. They just, in my perspective, is that the next step is like smoothing the forest. I argue that the carbon works in tandem with the other environmental projects as a smoothing object that advances homogenization of the territory, because the idea to sequestrate more carbon requires a more species that grow faster, because it's the idea that younger trees that grow faster, they can sequestrate more carbon. which has been, there are some studies that contradict this, but that's another story. But that's the idea that was implemented in San Juan La Chao at the beginning, and was one of the contested ideas by the community, because they were cutting down the old trees. So moreover, clearly defined boundaries, that is, where is the boundary where carbon starts or not, control plots or plots with certain ecological characteristics were based on satellite image and fieldwork, but few people had exact knowledge of the full area or had access to a map. So thus the carbon frontier were legible for external actors, but blurred for inhabitants and communal authorities. Finally, the next step is obviously selling the credits. At the final phase in this, in the credit selling and reselling for the final user, there is no reference price for carbon. This is a voluntary market, very flexible, and as I say, they have these core values, but also the additional attributes. But there is no definition of or the reference price. So it remains very volatile and speculative. So how these carbon credits are rationalized and advertised after their allocation speaks to the mechanism through which these are valued and how relations are produced for production become obscure. So price volatility makes it difficult for communities to forecast the revenues from one year to another, and completely obscures the value of carbon for communities as labor surplus extraction or salvage accumulation, as noted by Tsing, from the ecological processes that are erased. So for example, in San Juan La Chao, they sold the first year to Palo Alto 70,000 tons of carbon at $8 per ton, which neutralize only 10% of the city annual emissions from natural gas use. Later, in 2019, La Chao sold 6,064 tons at $6.5. An inferior price, obviously, that corresponds to vintage, that is previous year's production of carbon. And the final offer, which is placed by Disney, is for $2.5 per ton, because of the participation of Disney in the protocol. Moreover, the grammar is also very important. For example, I trace where the La Chao carbons end up, and I found a Scandinavian company that sells carbon through an app that is called Joro. And it was very telling how they describe the project. In the brief description, they say, without the project, the main activity is slash and burn, agriculture with some cattle grazing. Through the forest intervention, forest destruction become forest regeneration. So finally, I see it's very different. This is very, or has different aspects, or may say effects in the communities and the landscape. First of all, the inequalities embedded in the value. Because of the speculative and predictable features, the risk goes to the producers and the managers, along with the value extraction across the chain that produces an uneven geography of emissions that I was referring. Also, the landscape transformation, because of management for younger trees and rapid growing species, are preferred for commercialization. And is also in the same line as timber extraction. So the abstraction and simplification that carbon must be subjected to be marketable gets rid to the uncertainties and unknowns of the carbon cycle. Finally, the grammar discourses also embedded in this carbon legitimizes the integrity and transparency of carbon, which goes hand in hand with tropicalization, portraying the landscapes and community in need of these interventions. So I just want to end up saying that carbon markets are also part of this big package of environmental conservation measurements, but particularly carbon has two consequences. First of all, it disciplines the forest landscape. And second, it brings about new frontiers. So carbon functions as a form of disciplining the land or the land use that is working towards determining the vocation of the commons and establishing a scheme of rent over the common land by territorializing capital otherwise. It becomes a form of appropriation that is gradual instead of spectacular or abrupt as other extractive activities that we have discussed previously, that commoditizes the forest over local understandings of forest and community relationships. So I just want to finish with citing an article by Disney Assistant General Counsel that he was talking about the San Juan Lachao forest project, and he was saying that, well, this is a grazed and in poor condition landscape, while the project is depicted as something to provide clean water and improve the standards of living of its people. The author, referring to the Disney consul, and I quote, "It is exactly those clean water and employment and economic benefits that made the project so attractive to Disney, as well as the partnership with and participation of the local community. This project just has a fantastic history to tell." Thank you.
So I think you're on now.
Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from Guyana. I want to take off my video for proper connection, but I don't know, because I might get bounced off if I leave on my camera. Do you think it's okay?
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay, let's go then. Okay, thank you so much for having me to be part of this panel. And I'm joining you from a very remote village. That is my village in Aishalton in Guyana. And I am so grateful to be here today. Firstly, I would like to speak about what extractivism means for us as the Wapichan people, the Wapichan communities. So the understanding of extractivism is grounded in our practical experience. We can look to the land we live on and see the harmful effects of extraction of natural resources on our livelihoods, on our environment, and our people. Through my work with the Wapichan Weir Women's Movement, I am often in villages communicating with women regularly and hearing their concerns. One issue in particular comes up frequently. Food staples are harder and harder to come by. Extractive industries like the gold mining that takes place on our territory disrupt our existing food economies. And the global economy built on extractivism has created the climate crisis. This is also undermining our food supply. This threatens food security and hurts the health of our community. We have been fighting for years to have extractive industries regulated. Still, mining on our lands happens without our permission. This mining is often done irresponsibly, leaving destruction in its wake. And even when extractive industries take advantage of indigenous people and resources on indigenous land, the benefits are not felt by our people. I'll speak a bit about mining and oil extractive industries in Guyana, particularly in the Wapichan territory. The extraction of gold is a key concern. Marudi Mountain, an important sacred site within our territory, is one of the gold mines that is currently run by Gold Shield Resources. They have a prospecting license, and on that license, small miners are put on the land to mine without the free, prior, and informed consent of our people, and in violation of our internationally protected rights. Gold mining is one of the largest threats to our lands, and it is starting to influence our lived environment as well. We see it, the impact on our environment, our livelihoods, and through social issues that follow the mines. First, there are the harms that mines cause to our local environments. Mining leads to forest degradation, and runoffs of harmful chemicals from the mine are reaching our water bodies. In particular, there are other harms that come from the use of mercury in gold mines. Mercury runoffs are often reach the headwaters, which hurt local wildlife and contaminates the drinking supply that we rely on. Many of our communities rely on the rivers to be part of their livelihoods for fishing, for gathering, and so on. Second, gold mines often lead to many social problems. Local men and boys are occasionally given opportunities to work in the mines. These opportunities come with large downside costs. Mining companies bring many outsiders onto our territory from other regions and other countries. With these outsiders come the risk of disease transmission. COVID remains a concern, as does the spread of other venereal diseases. Mines also often lead to an increase in alcohol consumption among the men who work there. Alcoholism and other drugs are used, and this tears our families apart, and women and girls often suffer from it. One of these downstream social issues is disruption of our food economy. When mining replaces a local economy, the traditional food economy is disrupted. People would otherwise work on farms, who used to work on their farms would now come to depend on the little amount of gold earned as an income. But there is not enough growing and production of our traditional local foods to support the population. When Wapichan people aren't able to farm our own foods, we have to turn to the mass-produced unimported foods. These outside foods are more processed, less nutritious, and are not healthy, which often leads to an increase in chronic illnesses. Just the other day, we had a 33-year-old man who died from diabetes. And this is very disturbing for us. This was thrown into relief as well at a recent gender workshop that I hosted in one of our villages, where women told me that they were they're diagnosed, of food-related illnesses, and more this is on the rise in our communities. And without easy access to medical interventions like insulin, sometimes it's not available in our community to treat these mortality increases. I would also like to discuss the huge extractive industry currently at work in Guyana, the new oil and gas boom. Oil and gas are not being taken from Wapichan territory. The current oil exploration and drilling is happening off the coast of Guyana, but I am very concerned with the implications of the growth of Guyana's oil industry and climate change, which affects us all. Like mining, the oil and gas industry has large negative environmental impacts that make it more difficult for Wapchan people to grow food that we rely on. One of the climate change's many effects is that it changes the weather patterns, including the seasonal rains. We have seen abnormal flooding destroy crops of essential staples like cassava, and we are not able to make our staple, the main staple that we depend on, and agricultural adaptation is very difficult for us. Beyond the climate impacts, I am concerned about the growth of the oil and gas offshores of Guyana, what it means for our savanna, because where we live, we have forests, we also have savannas, we have different landscapes. And the oil boom is fueling infrastructure development across the country and is attracting investors. These investors are looking to Guyana and they see opportunities. Our land are seen as what we say money. We have vast lands, but it is seen as money. When the development of roads and infrastructure is welcome, it opens land to more potential intrusion from outsiders. It's hard to understand what risk this might pose when there is not a lot of clear information about this development. It is essential as Guyana embarks on this infrastructure and development path that governments take care to properly inform Indigenous peoples of development that may impact their lands and to respect Indigenous peoples' rights, including the right to free, prior, and informed consent regarding any development that may impact our land and resources. What we as Wapchan people have been doing. In response to all these challenges, Indigenous peoples have developed strategies for climate adaptation and for addressing our food security crisis. Already, the SRDC, which is like the umbrella organization, has actively started monitoring and managing vital ecosystems in the community that can help with climate resilience. If the government of Guyana will recognize our land rights over customary lands, we can ensure that our territory will sustainably be protected through Indigenous managed protected areas. Going forward, we will promote growing local foods so that we do not have to depend on food from the outside. The SRDC places the economic development of the region in a healthy, sustainable way that promotes traditional ways of food production at the top of our priority list. We have the tools to make these goals work. Our main challenge is making sure that we have the resources and money to see these plans. In the short term, the SRDC is promoting sustainable livelihood projects. We can monitor the sale of carbon credits. We just heard the first panelist speak about carbon credits, and what we're thinking is how that money can be used to contribute to our initiatives and to address the immediate risk of food security, while being concerned about elements of Guyana's sale of carbon credits that violate in communities' rights. One way this money can be used is to go to families who can purchase farming tools and other to be self-sufficient in farming. We also hope to set up small factories to produce our main staple, that is farine and cassava bread, so we can have food security. This can help make and store farine for a time, when we have the floods, then we will have enough food. Sustainable livelihood projects like these will help make our people more resilient to climate change and more sufficient. And we are also working to develop plans to ensure the efforts can be managed in long term. The ultimate goal is to build a local and self-sufficient food system at a district and region-wide level. This requires significant investment in our farming technology. We need supplies like mesh for chicken pens, wire, fencing to fence to keep our animals in. Many people are willing to turn back to farming. They just need funding to get these projects off the ground. We plan to support our village councils. Village councils are the governing bodies of our communities. And we work with village councils to help implement their plans as well. In conclusion, indigenous people in Guyana are facing extreme pressure from extractive industries and climate change. And one of these ways are felt most acutely in our disrupted food system and food insecurity, as I mentioned earlier. We have plans to adapt to our changing climate, to protect and develop our land sustainably, and to address our food challenges. We have tools at our disposal to make these goals a possibility. Our main challenge is protecting our lands through legal recognition to prevent its sale by the government to extractive actors, and making sure that we have the resources and the money to bring this all to fruition. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a very stimulating day so far, and I hope that you're not very bored at the end of the day. I would like to share some ideas here that aim to contribute to discussions about how plural notions of justice emerge in the daily practices of resistance and negotiation as responses to colonialism, extractivism, and inequalities. I'm particularly interested in questions about how injustices and inequalities across species are framed and understood in the long-term struggles of Afro-Indigenous and Mestizo communities and their attempts to shift power imbalances in the context of colonial and neoliberal governance. This approach builds on the invitations by Malcolm Ferdinand, Avi Chomsky, Olufemi Taiwo, and among others to address climate justice by recentering the long-term struggle across experiences of forced labor, dispossession, slavery, and colonialism. In particular, and building on the work of Ferdinand, I attempt to respond to the fracture that separates ecological and environmental movements from post-colonial and anti-racist struggles, that erases the continuities that saw humans and non-humans confused as resources, fitting the same colonial project, and that makes the links between the history of colonialism and the history of environmental destruction invisible. As Catherine Yusuf notes, this invisibility results in a white Anthropocene, which erases not only the colonial experience of human exploitation, but also, relevant for my argument, it erases the interspecies alliances embedded in anti-colonial attempts to constitute more than human spaces of sovereignty and autonomy. I build here on the expansive work unveiling how the lives and deaths of plants, animals, microbes, and fungi, among other living organisms, are intertwined within human worlds. Multi-species justice has broadened questions about who the subjects of justice are, what is at stake when they are captured by legal systems or social movements, who benefits, in other words, who is a world, whose world counts, and what is at stake. Multi-species justice has expanded questions about distributed and procedural theories of justice. For instance, in terms of personhood before the law and resources we owe to subjects of the law, which are central today to discussions on the rights of nature. More broadly, capability-centered approaches to multi-species justice have offered new opportunities to consider the biological, physiological, and cognitive well-being of animals, as well as their social relationships and ecological interdependencies with humans and other species. It is important to attend that while many of us tend to think of other species as plants and animals, they're part of a more complex and multi-scale interplay of chemical and biological species. This is, of course, more obvious in the case of toxic chemicals or pollution, but it's also true in the case of biochemical interactions central to sustaining life on Earth, for instance, nitrogen-fixing bacteria in soils. The ideas I share with you today are part of a work in progress that focuses on legal disputes over access to land and resources as macro-biopolitical strategies to foster more than human sovereignty in the context of colonial, post-colonial, and neoliberal governance. For the sake of time, I'll briefly focus here on two examples, or what I call entry points. I'll start by describing my argument. I'll provide a brief description of these two examples or entry points, and I'll finish with some reflections about the case for multi-species justice and more than human sovereignty. In Latin America, as in other parts of the global south, contesting extractivism has often taken the shape of attempts aiming to protect communal access and control over land and natural resources. These attempts have at least two important features. First, they have often included strategies to shift, control, or disrupt the flow of biogeochemical entities and resources, including the control over modes of production, or to restore or maintain the biophysical and metaphysical life and movement of critical ecosystems, plants and animals. Second, these have also often attempted to recenter the voices of marginalized entities and racialized communities in decision-making, aiming to enhance, correct, or protect various forms of epistemics and procedural justice for humans and nature. I argue that multi-species justice and inter-species alliances have been central to these attempts and to the struggle to defend communal property rights, livelihoods, and access to land and resources, as they are essential for the biocultural survival of communities. I propose that understanding climate and environmental justice as the struggle over the governance of those biogeochemical entities and flows helps recenter the place of multi-species justice and inter-species alliances as vital biophysical and metaphysical components in the daily anti-extractivist practice of marginalized and racialized communities. This helps emphasize that historically, human and environmental rights have been embedded in the livelihoods and the practices of resistance and negotiations of campesinos, agricultores, workers, Afro-Indigenous, and Mestizo communities. It also helps highlight that contesting extractivism in the scholarship and practice of climate justice requires close attention to the forms and strategies communities have created to protect multiple notions of more than human justice, sovereignty, and autonomy. My first case, Real Audiencia, Santiago, 1797. Sebastián Gonzalez filed a lawsuit against Don Juan Francisco Guzmán to stop his imminent sale outside El Reino de Chile, probably to Lima or to Buenos Aires. The colonial records identify Sebastián as mulatto, arriero, and a slave of Juan Francisco. As in other legal procedures led by Afro-Mestizos enslaved individuals and families in the late 18th century, Sebastián's case shows the expansive knowledge of the legal system and the diverse social and economic networks he's able to display to support his case. More importantly, for the argument I'm trying to make here, Sebastián's case highlights how access and control over animals and land were central to the strategies to protect relative levels of sovereignty in a slave-making society and in the context of colonial rule. His argument in the case focuses on the fact that he shouldn't be sold outside Santiago while a trial is pending on the collection of cattle inherited from his parents. In addition to this case about his inheritance, Sebastián has another active lawsuit against Don Miguel Ampuero for a debt for the sale of 24 horses, which Miguel only partially paid to Sebastián at the moment of the transaction 8 years before. Witnesses in the case testify about Sebastián's wide circulation trading animals between Santiago, Bucalemo, and Colina, where the hacienda of Francisco Guzmán is located, and his previous work raising them in the chacra in Bucalemo, where his parents used to work. The legal status of his parents is unclear, and Sebastián's property rights are not really disputed in the case. His commercial networks and relative economic autonomy seem to have operated independently of the commitments with Juan Francisco, his legal owner, and with his relative consent. The ability to conduct his own businesses or to be placed under the service of another person under a lease or similar were indeed widespread practices of forced labor outside plantation economies in Latin America. It is important to remember that forced labor and forced migrations were also common colonial practices governing the bodies of indigenous and mestizo communities within and beyond the legal limits of esclavitud indígena. More importantly, cases aiming to correct or contest individual actions that change who govern those bodies as part of bioeconomic flows show the centrality of access to animals and land as a strategy for subsistence and autonomy, and its central role in building a kind of sovereignty that depends on more than human assemblages. Sebastian's case is not unique in the archives. Much attention to the use of the legal system in colonial Latin America by African descendants and their families has focused on the pursuit of legal freedom. However, a de facto legal personhood allowed enslaved individuals to use the judicial system broadly to negotiate their social, racial, and economic status and protect agreements regarding access to land, ownership of animals, and control over economic activities that provided relative levels of autonomy. This is particularly true in urban colonial centers in the late 18th century and in more diverse economic systems. Although I avoid understanding these legal attempts as strategies directly conducing to legal freedom and abolition, they are intergenerational, long-term, and collectively orchestrated strategies aimed at reshaping the material limits of slavery in colonial rule. Reclaiming spaces of financial autonomy or control over land, animals, and resources was many times paired with strategies manipulating racial and ethnic categories. Through the course of these cases, these individuals appear to combine different racial categories, negro, pardo, mulatto, sambo, or sometimes providing hybrid overlapping categories such as mulata blanca or negro sambo. More than human life, land, animals, water, plants were central to what was at stake. Discussing attempts to contest the limits of slavery and blackness as judicial actions embedded in multi-species and racialized notions of sovereignty and autonomy remind us that the work of contesting the limits of slavery and blackness was also the work of interspecies alliances for survival. Beyond colonial courts, cimarronaje also required shifting governance of land and bodies. Afro-Indigenous and Mestizo geographies were embedded in resources flows and more than human relations, which are central to the extractive activities their bodies serve, but also to their strategies to survive and contest. My second case, San Felipe de Moyeturo, Ecuador, 2008. Courtrooms today are also perhaps the most recognizable public arena where people are pursuing multi-species justice within existing post-colonial and neoliberal legal frameworks. Rights of nature have expanded for more than a decade in nations such as Ecuador, Bolivia, Australia, India, among others. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country to grant constitutional rights to Mother Nature or Pachamama. Ecuador's constitution presents Buen Vivir as a set of rights for humans, communities, and nature, and portrays rights of nature as a tool for achieving an alternative model of development based on indigenous cosmologies and that challenges neoliberal governance. Contestation of rights of nature quickly escalated after the signing of the Constitution. These rights immediately conflicted with the Ecuadorian government plans to expand large-scale mining projects and oil extraction. Numerous lawsuits were filed to protect nature's rights with uneven results. As we learned earlier today, rights of nature has produced different and complicated results, and we cannot assume there are an overnight solution. After an initial period with limited success, some recent cases have been effective at expanding issues of control and access to land and resources as part of broader attempts to reinforce indigenous and environmental rights simultaneously. For instance, the 2018 court ruling that shutdown of the Rio Blanco mine that was mentioned earlier today, south of Guayaquil, represents a relatively successful case, and I would like to explain a little bit more why. In 2018, indigenous communities in Moyeturo sued a Chinese mining company to protect Rio Blanco. The basis of the case, as Manuela mentioned before today, was the failure to provide prior consultation of communities tied to the International Labour Organization Convention 169, which has been used in several nature rights cases. But the indigenous community also brought, in this case, questions and claim violations of the rights of nature under Article 71 of the Constitution. In their arguments, they emphasize the connection between the rights of nature and indigenous rights. Members of the Moyeturo community cited polluted water and dry land that could no longer sustain traditional indigenous agricultural lifestyles and subsistence. And I'll finish here. The ruling that closed the Rio Blanco mine, as in other rights of nature cases in Latin America, is just a temporary legal victory that might still be overturned with future appeals. As in the case of Sebastian, we don't know the end of the story. We don't know the end story about aluminum or many other of the issues that we have discussed here. And this is part of my point. Justice for human and ecological communities is often provisional and a fragile achievement, which raises several important questions at the intersection of scholarship and activism. How do we understand these fragmented, limited, but effective, successful attempts to shift who governs, who benefits, who is listened, who is harmed, as part of a longer genealogy of multi-species, intersectional, anti-colonial strategies to contest the colonial and neoliberal governance of more than human bodies? How learning from these attempts can foster alliances that recognize more than human sovereignty as a fundamental part of the colonial and post-colonial history of activism and political cultures in the region. And still understanding that those attempts sometimes are competing, fragmented, and don't end in successful stories. How examining multi-species notions of justice in the daily practices of resistance and negotiation as responses to colonialism, extractivism, and inequalities can help expand our understanding of how abiotic, elemental, and molecular entities can co-become in physical, legal, and spiritual worlds, refusing the nature-culture divide. How these attempts to control, shift, and govern biogeochemical flows help us recenter questions about socio-ecological sovereignty as practices and spaces that foster decolonial, intersectional, and interspecies alliances. And finally, and following Malcolm Ferdinand here, how can we emphasize, how can we highlight relationships, the ethics before ontology? Thank you.
Thank you for our panel. Maybe we can sit up front and reconvene here and have some questions and answers discussion. Is Immaculata still there?
Yeah, she's still on.
Okay, good. Great, so thank you for such a wonderful panel. Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay. Good, so yes, go ahead. Yes, could you introduce yourself, please, and then we'll bring the mics around. Thank you.
Hi, Esther Figueroa. This is for you, William.
Mm-hmm.
Have you followed the legal ecocide framework at all? And I was wondering, given the rights of nature framework, what you think of it?
Yeah, I follow it somehow. I feel like I shouldn't say that I'm an expert or completely follow that. So if you would like to share some additional thoughts on that, would be great.
Well, there's the UN side of it, right? So there's been all this effort to define it for a kind of UN charter, right? And then there's the, as was mentioned earlier, there was the attempt to bring it into the crimes that would be the same as war crimes, that whole thing. And so there's been huge arguments over not just definition, but scope.
Yeah.
So currently the definitions have tried to contain it so that it kind of gets away from historical, or so it, you know, if it's too large, you can't deal with it, right? So obviously ecocide is a huge thing. So instead, the definitions and the legal framework tries to contain it within something you could prove or something that you could give responsibility for, which is kind of the opposite of what ecocide often is. I don't know, are you aware of those arguments? You want to add? No?
No,
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the same thing with like early histories of agrochemicals and trying to prove whether it's like look at like early arsenic, like was it, we know that arsenic is acutely poisonous, but they were able to solve that it was chronically poisonous. Took forever, and we're still dealing with that, and Latin America has the most contamination zones of arsenic in the world. I do have a question though.
Can we, maybe we can get first the response from the panel, and then we'll come back to you, Jason.
It's a great question. I feel like I don't know enough, and I haven't been following the debate that much. Now, I would answer by emphasizing that I've been following Rights of Nature for a while in terms of how indigenous movements and indigenous activism has been able to put in the mainstream legal framework discussions about human-nature interactions that go beyond kind of traditional Western ideas, right? And today we're talking about rights of nature at an international level, right? Within the UN system, they're part of discussions. Of course, we don't have an international agreement on rights of nature yet, right? And I think it's very important and it's very meaningful to see that process and follow that process. And I imagine that might be connected somehow with the ecocide kind of discussion. I do think still that what I'm more interested about is about how rights of nature operates, right, at the local level, how it's used by individuals and communities to contest, to negotiate, right, to find a way, right, to build a small place where they can protect, right, a particular ecosystem or the livelihoods, right? I imagine somehow that the process at an international level is going to follow other processes. It's going to be a slow process. It's going to be, in many situations, going to feel frustrated that there is an agreement, but then how that translates to the ground. We have many questions about that, and that's why I think my entry point is trying to really look at how communities are using these kind of legal instruments, right? It's interesting what happens with the prior consent, right? It's been around for a long time, and suddenly it's kind of like coming back with a different shape, right, or a different meaning, right? I remember when years ago when I started learning about prior consent, I guess the argument or what I learned was that it was a legal tool that it was not really effective, right? It seems to me that it's being effective now in cases appealing to rights of nature, for instance, right? Either as one of the many mechanisms, right? So yeah, I would expect more discussions about ecocide and how that would shape an international level, but I think I'm more curious. I think more new things that we haven't seen might appear from how communities and individuals are using these legal tools, right, to negotiate, adapt, right, or protect certain spaces.
Great. Immaculata, did you have a response or any comment on that as well? I just didn't want to, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond or to engage this question as well. Can you hear me, Immaculata? Okay.
Yes. Firstly, I would just like to say, for us here in the Wapichan territory, we have used our forest and we have defended it, I would say, from extractive industries. We have been standing, we have been advocating for our land rights to gain. Parts of our lands are legally recognized, but not the extent of our entire territory. So because there's a legislation that exists in Guyana, the Amerindian Act of 2006, there are some provisions in that legislation, but it doesn't fully protect our rights to our traditional lands. And so what happens is that we have more control over what happens when we have legal ownership to the land. But because we do not have legal ownership to our traditional lands, that is where the mining and all these concessions, logging concessions are being placed by the government. And if I feel like as a people, as indigenous people, we can have legal ownership for those lands and we have better control of what happens on these lands, because we have been monitoring our forests, our lands within the Wapichan territory. And we did a mercury survey, we did water testing, and sometimes we would give all these reports to the government, to different government agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and so on. In that way, we know what is happening on our lands. We are here, but sometimes people do not listen to us, but because I think we are united in our organization, we stand together, all 21 leaders, they're called tushals in our villages, would stand together to say, this is to the government, you cannot do this, or we need to be part of the agreement that is being signed as it relates to mining. So first of all is having that right, that legal right to own your lands. And I would say asserting those rights as well. It's not hard in our community. It's a bit hard, I would say sometimes. I was wrong just now, because you have a lot of these different political agents in our communities that sometimes tend to break our leadership, the leadership of the traditional organizations, but then we need to stand strong and we need to stand as one. So that is what we have been doing here. Just listening to the talks about protecting nature, rights to nature. Everything we see in nature, we see it as a gift, and the first panelists talk about the commoditization of the forest, the resources now. That is something very hard for us to really grasp, the different carbon credits, carbon markets, and all of this is happening. It's hard for us as a people, but we still try to see how we can learn and how we can have information, because this is very important for us on the ground to be up to date of what is happening at the national level in our country, at the international level. So that is what we have been doing here. Yes, so legal ownership to our lands is very important to us, and in that way we can continue to defend those forests and continue to ensure that it is there standing for generations to come, just as how it was left by our forefathers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just because we're a small group and I want to make sure we have as many voices as possible, so we'll go to the next question, and then Jeronimo, if you have a response either to that or this question, we'll start with you. So go ahead.
Thank you guys, all three of you, for lovely presentations. I guess I'm wondering, and I think this connects all of the projects. I remember Amakulata talking about there being forest and savanna. I don't want to talk about all forests as being equal, and it really directly talks about forests. So I'm wondering particularly about, are all forests conducive to extraction or even carbon offsets in the same way? So I'm thinking about particularly dry tropical seasonal forests, which are very understudied. There's 66% of them are in Latin America, and they're the most endangered type of forests in the world because they're more conducive to human development and agricultural development, because they have less biomass, fewer pathogens, crop cycle are more conducive to the climate. So I ask to all of you, does the type of forest, are there certain forests easier to protect? Are there certain forests that are easier for carbon offsets? Are there certain forests that speak to multi-species connections in different ways? Latin America does have particular distinct types of forests, and I think that might be interesting to put on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think mostly pine and oak forest are the ones that have more interest by the companies interested in carbon offsets. However, there is every time more interested in mangroves, for example, or other types of ecosystems. And there is also this discussion about soil, because the soil also sequestrates a lot of carbon. And it's not, that's something also questioned in La Chao, because they don't consider, in this protocol, for example, and developing in Mexico, they don't consider the flux of carbon in the soil. So it could be 3 times more than the forest itself. So it's a lot of carbon that is not considered, no, in those terms. But yeah, Mexico, I mean, I'm still understanding this boom in carbon offset. It's just in the last 5 years that so many new projects have begun, and there is a diversity in not only the ecosystems, but also the communities that are engaging with these projects. So that's something that I'm really looking at and very interested in to know. So maybe I have a better answer later.
Very briefly, too, I'm not an expert on forests or trees, but just to provide a couple of examples, I think those questions are very important when we try to go deeper into we tend to think about humans and nature, right, in this kind of binary, and depending on our discipline or our training, right, we're able to think more carefully about the differences between humans, right, and different kind of human societies and hierarchies that we all create, but also the differences between different non-human species, right? And I think going deeper into those discussions matter when we think about multi-species justices or power imbalances across different species, right? A couple of examples that I think are important to think about those differences, or to answer the question about what kind of trees could foster more diverse multi-species kind of relationships, right? So I think the case of Araucaria is a very good example, right? Araucaria is a tree species that has evolved like since the time where like South America and Africa were together, right? So evolutionary biologists today study Araucarias because they co-evolve with a particular kind of beetle, right? As a companion species, if you want to call them like that, right? And they're also very important for Mapuche cosmologies in southern Chile, right? So it's a very good example of those kind of assemblages that tells a story about those alliances, right? Araucarias today are considered a symbol for certain Chileans, I would say, right? But also there are a lot of movement anti-indigenous activism and indigenous identities are going on in Chile, for instance, right? So the tree represents also a negative element that attempts against a nationhood, right? Or what Chilenidad means, right, for certain sectors of the population, right? So it's a very interesting case. And it's interesting that Araucaria today in southern Chile kind of coexist, not really, but with eucalyptus and pine forestry, right? Which are, of course, part of a massive kind of business to the forestry industry, right? It started in the 1970s with Pinochet, right, and expanded today. There are big wildfires happening today in Chile, right? Of course, linked to what eucalyptus and pine trees do to the soil, which is like take a lot of water, right? And of course, don't foster the kind of ecosystems that would allow to protect, right, certain forests or ecosystems from wildfires, right? There is a lot of research today on indigenous fire management strategies, right, that were erased by state officials or technicians or expert knowledge, right? In Chile, Australia, and California are good examples of that, and I think they do provide a good example of how thinking about these different species, what they do, and how they interact with other non-human species, and how they interact with humans, right, matters a lot when we think about these power imbalances, right? When we really want to think more carefully about justice.
That's great. So we have just a few more minutes, and I want to allow Immaculata to maybe give us the last words here and close us out for this session. So any last commentary that you'd like to make or respond to the question of trees and companion species or anything that you'd like to offer us to close us out?
Well, as I said, we're still learning to to grasp all of these new developments as Wapchan people. And for Guyana, I know that carbon credits are from the tree, the entire tree covers. I know it's based on the forest cover, other than not from the savanna lands or the creeks or lakes. It's more forest cover. That is what Guyana is being paid for. I think just in December, Guyana signed the deal with Hess Corporation, which up to date, we as Indigenous people are still very concerned about, because even our titled lands are placed on that market, or is part of the deal, we would say, without seeking the consent of our people, our individual communities. So that is still a concern. So we have vast savanna lands, but I don't think the carbon offsets are from there. It comes more from the forest. So it is to have looking to have more of these forests, intact forests, standing forests from Guyana. The deal that was signed just lately with Hess Corporation was, I think, $750 million USD. Out of that, as Indigenous people, we only got 15% of that money, which we felt was not fair to us, because these forests are in our lands. All of our lands as Indigenous people, our forests are intact. So it is still a concern, and yeah, it's not being looked at more from the savanna level, where we have a lot of savanna grasslands and lakes and creeks within the different ecosystems that exist here.
So I just want to thank this panel and also say that I'm really struck by the kind of multi-methodological approach that was brought forward here, the kind of trans-temporal, court cases that we saw and heard from, local Indigenous practice and systems and ways of, thinking on the other side of the colonial divide, as it were, towards sustainability, and the kind of tracking of carbon offsetting and solutions. That's really very scalar analysis. So I just really appreciate the complexity of methodology that we heard from in this panel. So thank you, everyone, for your comments, and thank you to our panelists today.
Thank you.